The grand old house, a Victorian masterpiece nestled on a quiet tree-lined street in Kensington, had always been Sylvia's sanctuary. Its soaring ceilings, the gentle creak of its ancient floorboards, and the kaleidoscope of colors filtering through its stained glass windows had become her solace after the passing of Richard, her beloved husband. 55 years they had shared, a lifetime woven into the very fabric of this home. For the past 2 years, however, Sylvia had woken alone in their sprawling master bedroom, each antique object a silent testament to a memory, a laugh, a shared dream. This morning, a jarring clinking of dishes from the main floor shattered the quiet reverence of dawn. The clock on her bedside table read 7:30, far too early for Doris, her cherished housekeeper, who usually brought her Earl Grey at precisely 8. A knot of unease tightened in Sylvia's stomach as she slipped on her silk robe, a gift from Richard on their 40th anniversary, and began her descent down the wide, curving staircase, her hand gripping the polished banister a little tighter than she cared to admit at 78. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Oh, good morning, Sylvia. Serafina's voice, sharp and overly cheerful, sliced through the morning air before Sylvia even reached the dining room. Serafina, Richard's daughter from his first marriage, always called her by her first name, never mother, or even Mrs. Caldwell. It was a subtle but persistent reminder of their strained relationship, a deliberate erasure of the decades Sylvia had spent as Richard's wife and the matriarch of this house. "We didn't want to wake you," she chirped, the we encompassing herself and Marcus, Richard's son, who sat at the grand mahogany table engrossed in a financial newspaper, a steaming cup of coffee clutched in his hand. He barely offered a grunt of acknowledgement, his eyes fixed on the columns of text. "Good morning," Sylvia replied, her voice calm despite the tremor of irritation that began to ripple through her. She surveyed the dining room, a space that had always been a bastion of elegance and tradition. Something was undeniably different. Her gaze swept across the familiar landscape of antique furniture, the vibrant Persian rug, the ornate chandelier, until it snagged on the buffet. Her breath caught. The exquisite Limoges china set, a cherished wedding gift from Richard's grandmother, which had graced their table for every special occasion for over half a century, was gone. In its place sat a stark, minimalist collection of white plates, so utterly devoid of character that Sylvia had never seen them before. "Where's the Limoges set?" Sylvia asked, striving to keep her voice level, to prevent the tremor from becoming a quake. "Oh, that old thing?" Serafina waved a dismissive hand as if swatting away a bothersome fly. "I put it away in the pantry. It's so archaic, Sylvia. These new plates are much more practical, and you can just toss them in the dishwasher." It wasn't a question, but a pronouncement, delivered with a saccharine smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Marcus finally lowered his newspaper, his expression a carefully neutral mask. "Serafina's just trying to modernize the house, Mother. You know how hard it is to find help, willing to mess around with hand-washing china." Sylvia wanted to argue, to point out that Doris, who had served them faithfully for 20 years, had never once complained about the Limoges. But she bit her tongue, the words dying in her throat. This was the first overt act of interference, but by no means the last. Serafina and Marcus had moved in 6 months ago, just after Richard's passing. "Temporarily," Marcus had assured her then, "until we sort out our own affairs." Their affairs, which Sylvia had generously helped them with over the years, seemed to stretch from the planned 3 weeks to an indefinite future. At first, Sylvia had been genuinely glad for the company. After Richard's death, the sprawling house had felt too vast, too quiet, echoing with a silence that was almost unbearable. For the first few weeks, Serafina had been outwardly gracious, cooking dinners, bringing Sylvia magazines, even inquiring about her extensive art collection. Marcus, Richard's eldest, whom Sylvia had always tried to foster a warm relationship with, was around again. She had foolishly hoped it was a chance to finally build the closeness that had always eluded them, a genuine family bond that Richard had so desperately wished for. But gradually, insidiously, things began to shift. First, Richard's cherished collection of antique globes and maps, which had adorned the living room for decades, disappeared. Serafina declared they disrupted the interior concept. Then, Sylvia's extensive library of rare botanical texts was relocated from the study to the dusty attic, deemed to be, quote, taking up too much space. Her beloved orchids, which bloomed in vibrant profusion on the sun-drenched windowsills, were replaced by a collection of spiky, uninspired succulents because, as Serafina explained with a shrug, they don't require much care. By the way, Doris isn't coming in today, Serafina announced, pouring herself another cup of coffee without offering Sylvia one. Sylvia felt her fingers tighten around the arm of her chair. Serafina had given Doris the day off without consulting her, the mistress of the house. She looked tired yesterday, Serafina added, shrugging dismissively. And I thought she could use a rest. Besides, I'm quite capable of handling the house on my own. I've got lots of ideas for making it more modern. Marcus nodded approvingly, his eyes still fixed on his newspaper, a familiar pattern. Always the same, avoiding conflict at all costs, preferring to agree with the loudest voice in the room. That voice, Sylvia mused bitterly, used to be hers. Now it was Serafina's. After a strained breakfast, Sylvia retreated to her private study, the only room that had so far escaped Serafina's relentless modernization. Here, amidst her meticulously organized catalogues of rare books and her cherished collection of miniature porcelain figurines, she still felt like herself, Sylvia Caldwell, a respected art historian whose opinion had once been sought after in galleries and auction houses across Europe. She sank into her worn leather armchair, its familiar embrace a small comfort, and gazed at a framed photograph of Richard on her desk. He was smiling, his eyes crinkling at the corners, a look of profound love and understanding. "What would you do, darling?" she whispered, but there was no answer. Richard had always been a man of peace, a diplomat not only by profession but by nature. Perhaps he would have found a way to talk to Marcus, to reason with Serafina, without causing a confrontation. A soft knock at the door startled her. "Come in," Sylvia called, her voice a little sharper than she intended. It was Serafina, balancing a tray. "I brought you tea," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "I know you're used to Doris bringing it at this time." "Thank you." Sylvia accepted the cup, immediately noticing that it wasn't her usual robust Earl Grey, but some insipid herbal concoction. "What is it?" Sylvia asked, trying to disguise her distaste. "Chamomile mint tea," Serafina answered, her tone bordering on condescending. "It's healthier for you than that strong black tea you drink. At your age, you need to watch your heart." At your age. The phrase had become a grating refrain in their daily conversations. At your age, you shouldn't lift heavy things. At your age, it's best not to walk up and down stairs alone. At your age, it's important to follow a regimen. My heart has been working perfectly fine for the last 78 years, Sylvia said dryly, looking directly at Serafina. I think it can handle Earl Grey too. Serafina pressed her lips together, a flicker of annoyance crossing her features. I'm just looking out for you, Sylvia. Marcus and I want you to be healthy for as long as possible. So I don't die before Richard's will is settled, and you can finally get your hands on this house, Sylvia thought cynically, but she remained silent. By the way, Serafina continued, oblivious or uncaring of Sylvia's thoughts, I invited some friends over for dinner tonight, nothing fancy, just a little soiree at my house. Sylvia couldn't contain her surprise. Your house? Well, technically, it's our house now too, Serafina corrected, her smile widening into a triumphant smirk. Besides, it would do you good to socialize. You spend too much time alone. With those words, she turned and walked out, leaving Sylvia with the herbal tea she had no intention of drinking. In the past, Sylvia would have objected, reminded Serafina that the house belonged to her, that she had the right to decide who visited it and when. But lately, she hadn't had the energy to argue. Every conflict with Serafina devolved into a one-act play where Sylvia invariably became the nagging, ungrateful stepmother and Serafina the patient, long-suffering stepdaughter forced to put up with her whims. By evening, the house was filled with strangers. Young couples, Marcus's colleagues from his architectural firm, a few of Serafina's friends, all of them talking too loudly, laughing too heartily at not particularly funny jokes, and drinking Sylvia's finest vintage wine without even noticing its quality. Sylvia sat in a quiet corner of the living room, a silent observer, watching Serafina flit between the guests like a seasoned hostess. She wore one of her designer dresses, a shimmering creation that likely cost more than Doris's monthly salary. Marcus followed her, a dutiful shadow, smiling and nodding as Serafina introduced him as a, quote, talented architect who will soon open his own studio. Sylvia knew that wasn't true. Marcus was merely a junior partner at his firm, and his own studio was a distant, improbable dream. But Serafina always exaggerated his accomplishments, as if trying to convince others, and perhaps herself, that she had married someone far more important than he was. When dinner was served, Sylvia found herself relegated to the far end of the table, almost at the kitchen door, while Serafina presided at the head, the place that had always belonged to Richard, or, in his absence, to Sylvia. "Sylvia, do you mind if we put on some music?" one of Serafina's friends asked, not waiting for an answer, and already heading for Sylvia's antique music system, a treasured heirloom. "Actually, I prefer," Sylvia began, but she was swiftly interrupted by Serafina. "Sure, Daphne, play whatever you want. Sylvia usually goes to bed early, so I don't think she'll be with us long." A few of the guests exchanged knowing glances, and Sylvia felt a wave of humiliation wash over her. She felt like an unwelcome nuisance at their party, rather than the rightful hostess of her own home. During dinner, the conversation turned to travel. Someone mentioned Florence, and Sylvia couldn't resist commenting. "Richard and I spent our 30th wedding anniversary in Florence," she said, turning to a young couple across the table. "It was in the early 90s. We stayed in a charming little villa overlooking the Arno, and one evening, we discovered this tiny trattoria with the most incredible truffle pasta." "Oh, Sylvia's talking about her travels again," Serafina interrupted loudly from across the table, her voice dripping with feigned exasperation. "You wouldn't believe how many stories she can recall about every town she and Richard have ever been to. Sometimes I think we've already heard about every Florentine piazza." The guests chuckled politely, and Sylvia fell silent, feeling the hot flush of shame creep up her neck. Serafina continued, now addressing the man sitting next to her. "Have you been to that new fusion restaurant in Soho? They say the sushi there is absolutely divine." The conversation flowed on, swirling around Sylvia like water around a rock. She sat silently, picking at her food. Some elaborate deconstructed dish Serafina had ordered from a trendy catering service, though Sylvia would have preferred something more traditional. Her thoughts drifted back to the times she had hosted dinner parties herself, when guests would eagerly lean forward to hear her talk about rare finds at auctions, or Richard's fascinating diplomatic anecdotes. As dinner drew to a close, Sylvia quietly excused herself and rose from the table. "I need a cup of water," she said, heading toward the kitchen. "Marcus, get your mother some water," Serafina commanded, her voice carrying across the room. "She shouldn't walk on her own in case she falls." Sylvia froze, her hand on the doorknob. "In case she falls? Like I'm an invalid? Like I can't walk 15 steps to the kitchen in my own house?" "I'm perfectly capable of walking to the kitchen on my own," she said, trying to keep her voice from shaking. "I'm not that decrepit yet." Serafina rolled her eyes, a gesture that did not escape Sylvia's notice. Marcus smiled awkwardly and went back to talking to his colleague. Neither of them stood up for her. No one even seemed to notice her humiliation. In the kitchen, Sylvia poured herself not water, but a generous glass of red wine, and drank it in a gulp, something she hadn't done in years. The wine burned her throat, but it was a pleasant burning, a sharp reminder that she was still alive, still able to feel. When she returned to the dining room, the guests had already migrated to the living room for coffee and dessert. Sylvia sat silently in her chair in the corner, watching Serafina proudly display a new, garish vase she'd placed on the mantelpiece, precisely where Sylvia and Richard's honeymoon picture used to be. "It's an exclusive design," Serafina declared, Cost a fortune, but it fits in perfectly, doesn't it? Sylvia wanted to say that the vase looked like a cheap, mass-produced knockoff, that it had no soul or history, unlike every object she'd spent years collecting for this house. But she remained silent. The boundaries of her influence in her own home grew more and more invisible, more and more transparent, until one day, she knew, they would disappear altogether. The guests finally departed around midnight. Sylvia had long since retired to her room, unable to bear any more false smiles and condescending glances. Lying in bed, she could hear Serafina and Marcus talking in the hallway, their voices muffled but distinct. "Your stepmother is getting weirder and weirder," Serafina complained. "Did you see the way she was looking at my vase? As if she wanted to smash it." "She's just getting old," Marcus replied with the same condescending tone he always used to talk about Sylvia now. "It's hard for her to accept change. We need to think seriously about the future." Serafina's voice was quieter, but Sylvia could still hear every word. This house is too big for her alone. Maybe it's time to think about other options. Sylvia knew what they meant. A nursing home, or, at best, a small apartment somewhere on the outskirts, while they took over her mansion. The house that Richard and she had turned into a work of art, every corner of which held a piece of their lives. She turned on her side and closed her eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. In the oppressive darkness of the night, the thought she'd been chasing away all these months finally took shape with piercing clarity. Richard's children were waiting for her to die, or at least for the moment when she would be weak enough for them. To take away everything she cared about, under the pretense of caring for her. And the worst part was, Sylvia didn't know how to fight it. A week passed after that humiliating dinner party. Sylvia tried to stay away from Serafina and Marcus, spending most of her time in her study. Doris, returning from her forced day off, became Sylvia's quiet ally. She brought Sylvia proper tea, cooked her favorite dishes, and occasionally lingered to talk. Real conversation, not the condescending phrases Richard's children bestowed upon her. On Wednesday, Marcus announced that they would have a, quote, family dinner on Sunday. "Just the three of us," he said with that special smile he used to get as a kid when he wanted another cookie before bedtime. "Just like old times." Sylvia looked at him skeptically but agreed. A part of her still hoped they could restore what had been lost between them. Maybe in a more intimate setting, without strangers, Marcus would once again become the son Richard had always hoped he would be, instead of a spineless appendage to Serafina. On Sunday, Sylvia wore her favorite blue silk dress that Richard had brought her from Kyoto. It was old-fashioned but elegant, and most importantly, it reminded her of the times when she was loved and respected. She even pulled out a pearl necklace that she usually only wore for special occasions. Serafina noticed her outfit when Sylvia came down for lunch. "How nice of you to dress like that for our little lunch," she said in a tone that might have been taken as a compliment if it hadn't been for the slight mockery in her eyes. "That dress must have been very fashionable once upon a time." Sylvia ignored the jab and sat down at the table, which was set not in the formal dining room, but in the smaller, cozier breakfast nook. The service was impeccable. White china, not her cherished Limoges, of course, crystal glasses, silverware which Serafina, to Sylvia's surprise, hadn't yet replaced with something more modern. "I thought it would be cozier here," Serafina explained, noticing Sylvia's gaze. "The dining room is so formal for a family dinner." Sylvia nodded, deciding not to argue over trivialities. Marcus appeared with a bottle of wine, one of the rare vintages Sylvia kept in the cellar for truly special occasions. "I picked out your favorite, Mother," he said, showing her the label of a 1998 Chateau Margaux. "It cost a fortune," Sylvia remarked, but without reproach. It was a small, unexpected kindness that he remembered her preferences. "Nothing would be spared for you," Marcus smiled, and for a fleeting moment Sylvia saw in him the boy she had raised. Attentive, kind, sincere. Doris brought the first course, asparagus cream soup, made to Sylvia's own recipe. It was a small act of resistance on Doris's part, Sylvia knew, as Serafina preferred the exotic dishes she ordered from restaurants. "Delicious, Doris," Sylvia said, tasting the soup. "Perfect as always." "A little bland," Serafina said, barely touching her plate. "But it'll do for Sunday lunch." Marcus began to talk about a new project at his firm, the reconstruction of an old theatre building in central London. Sylvia listened with sincere interest. Architecture had always been his passion, and at such moments, talking about his work, he seemed to shed the mask of indifference, becoming alive, real. "That's wonderful, darling," Sylvia said when he was finished. "The restoration of historic buildings is such a noble task. Your father would be so proud." The mention of Richard brought a fleeting shadow to Marcus's face. He had always been afraid of failing to live up to the expectations of his father, whom he respected and somewhat feared. Richard was a demanding man, but fair, and he adored his son, though he didn't always know how to show it. "Yes, I suppose so," Marcus said uncertainly, and quickly changed the subject. "How is your porcelain collection? You said you wanted to add another one, that Chinese one." "An 18th century Qing dynasty vase?" Sylvia nodded, surprised and touched that he'd remembered. "I'd been eyeing it at the Sotheby's auction, but it went for more than my limit." "What a shame to spend money on old trinkets," Serafina interjected, ruining their moment of togetherness. "Especially at your age, Sylvia. Wouldn't it be better to spend it on something more practical?" "Like what?" Sylvia asked, trying to remain calm. "Well, I don't know. Maybe fixing up this house." Serafina gestured around the room. "It's lovely, but it's so outdated. That wallpaper, those heavy drapes, it all looks like a museum exhibit." "It is a museum of sorts," Sylvia replied, her voice firm. "Everything here has a story, every object chosen with love and knowledge." Serafina shrugged. "If you say so. But I think a little modernity wouldn't hurt." After the soup, Doris brought out the main course, roast duck with oranges, another favorite recipe of Sylvia's. By this time, Marcus had opened a second bottle of wine, and the atmosphere had lightened a little. They talked about nothing in particular. The movies Serafina and Marcus had recently seen, the new exhibit at the Tate Gallery, the weather that was finally starting to resemble spring after a long gray winter. When it came to dessert, Sylvia asked Doris to bring tea. "Not chamomile tea," she added, with a slight, pointed smile toward Serafina. Doris returned with a tray containing cups of Sylvia's favorite Earl Grey and a plate of delicate pastries. She carefully placed the tray on the edge of the table and began pouring the tea. "Let me get that for you," Sylvia said, seeing that Doris's hands were trembling slightly. Doris had recently come down with a mild flu and was not yet fully recovered. Sylvia took the kettle and leaned over to pour the tea into the cups. She didn't know what happened next. Maybe her hands weren't as steady as she thought, or perhaps the tablecloth shifted, but the kettle shook in her hand, and the hot tea splashed over the edge, right into Serafina's lap. Serafina shrieked, a high-pitched, indignant sound, and jumped up, shaking off her dress. A cream-colored silk creation with intricate embroidery that probably cost more than Doris's monthly salary. "Oh my God!" Sylvia exclaimed, also standing up and grabbing a napkin. "I'm so sorry, it was an accident." "Accidental?" Serafina's voice rose an octave higher, shrill with fury. "You ruined my Chanel dress." "I didn't mean to." Sylvia held out the napkin, but Serafina slapped her hand away. "Of course, you didn't mean to." Serafina spat through gritted teeth. "Just like you didn't mean to criticize my choice of decor. Just like you didn't mean to remind Marcus of his father. Just like you didn't mean to make a fool of me in front of my friends at that dinner." "Serafina, please!" Marcus intervened, stepping between them, his face pale. "It was just an accident." "An accident?" Serafina turned to him, her face contorted with rage. "Your stepmother has been doing everything she can to make our lives difficult ever since we moved here. She's sabotaged every attempt I've made to make this house comfortable for us." "This is my home," Sylvia said quietly, but firmly, her voice trembling with indignation. "And I'm not sabotaging anything. I'm just trying to preserve what Richard and I have built over the years." "Richard! Richard! Richard!" Serafina threw her hands up in exasperation. "All we hear about is him. It's like time stopped when he died. But you know what, Sylvia? The world moves on. People change. Houses change. Everything changes. Only you're stuck in the past, clinging to old things and memories as if they can protect you from reality. And what is reality, Serafina? Sylvia asked, feeling the anger rising up inside her in a hot, overwhelming wave. That you and Richard's son are waiting for me to die so you can take possession of this house. That you plan to send me to a nursing home at the first opportunity. Mother! Marcus exclaimed, his voice laced with genuine shock. How can you say such a thing? I heard you talking after that dinner, Sylvia said, looking him straight in the eye. About this house being too big for me alone, about thinking of other options. I'm neither deaf nor blind, Marcus, though you both seem to prefer it that way. Serafina laughed, a cold, harsh sound that grated on Sylvia's nerves. You see, Marcus, she's also eavesdropping. What more proof do you need that she's an old woman out of her mind who sees conspiracies where there aren't any? I'm not out of my mind, Sylvia said, taking a step toward Serafina. And I won't have you talking to me like that in my own house. Your house? Serafina paused, then said slowly, with calculated cruelty, This house will be ours sooner than you think, Sylvia. And the first thing I'll do when it is ours is get rid of all this antique junk and turn it into something worthy of the 21st century. Sylvia felt the blood drain from her face. Serafina had said out loud what Sylvia had suspected all along, but hearing it was like being kicked in the gut. Over my dead body, Sylvia said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. If necessary, Serafina parried with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Enough. Marcus stepped between them, his face pale. Serafina, this is unacceptable. Mother, you misunderstood our conversation. We're just worried about you, that's all. Worried? Sylvia looked at him bitterly. You call that worrying? Your wife systematically forces me out of my own home, humiliates me in front of guests, changes things without my permission, and you just stand by and watch? She's exaggerating, as always, Serafina said, addressing Marcus as if Sylvia wasn't in the room. See why I said we need to think seriously about her condition? This paranoia, these accusations. I'm not paranoid, Sylvia exclaimed, her patience finally breaking. And I will not allow you to treat me like I'm incapacitated. She stepped towards Serafina again, intending to tell her everything she'd been holding back for months, but her gesture was too harsh, and she accidentally touched Serafina's hand, still wet with tea. Don't you dare touch me, Serafina shouted, and before Sylvia knew what was happening, Serafina's hand was up, and Sylvia felt a burning pain on her cheek. The slap was so sudden that Sylvia staggered, grabbing the edge of the table to keep from falling. There was dead silence in the room. Doris, who had appeared in the doorway, gasped and put her hand to her mouth. Sylvia slowly raised her hand to her burning cheek, unable to believe that this had really happened, that this woman, Richard's daughter, had dared to raise her hand against her in her own home. Marcus, Sylvia said quietly, turning to Richard's son, expecting his reaction, his defense, his outrage. But Marcus stood, eyes downcast, his arms hanging powerlessly along his body. He didn't look at Sylvia or Serafina, as if he hoped that if he avoided their gaze long enough, somehow it would all just go away. Serafina? He finally said, but his voice was weak, unconvincing. You shouldn't have done that. You shouldn't have? Sylvia questioned, not believing her ears. Your wife hit your stepmother and you say, you shouldn't have done it? She provoked me, Serafina said quickly, her voice suddenly pitiful, almost whiny. You saw her try to attack me. I was just defending myself. That's not true, Sylvia exclaimed. I didn't. Mother, please. Marcus held up his hand, stopping Sylvia. Let's all just calm down. This situation is out of control. Serafina shouldn't have hit you, but you were also emotional. Sylvia couldn't believe her ears. Richard's son, the one she had tried so hard to build a relationship with, the one she'd given so much to, was standing in front of her and actually justifying the woman who had just slapped her. Are you defending her? Sylvia asked, and her voice sounded strange even to herself. Too calm, too detached, as if this wasn't happening to her, but to someone else. I'm not defending, I'm just trying to be objective. Marcus finally looked up, but he was looking not at Sylvia but somewhere over her head. You both behaved unreasonably. Unreasonable? Sylvia repeated slowly, tasting the word. It's unreasonable to demand respect in your own home? It's unreasonable to expect Richard's son to take my side when his wife insults and humiliates me? Mother, you're dramatizing everything. That's your side. Serafina is just trying to help, to make this house more comfortable for all of us, and you take her every suggestion as a personal insult. Help? Sylvia couldn't hold back a bitter laugh. Serafina is not interested in my well-being, Marcus. She's only interested in this house, and what she can do with it when I'm gone. See? Serafina turned to Marcus, her face contorted in a grimace of feigned compassion. This is what I was talking about. This paranoia, these accusations. Your stepmother needs help, Marcus. Professional help. The only help I need, Sylvia said, looking directly at Serafina, is for both of you to leave my house. Serafina opened her mouth in feigned surprise, then turned to Marcus with an "I told you so" look on her face. Mother, you can't be serious, Marcus began, but Sylvia interrupted him. I am dead serious. I want you both to pack your things and leave tonight. This is insane, Serafina exclaimed. Marcus, tell her it's crazy. Marcus sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose as he always did when he was upset or embarrassed. Mother, we can't leave today. You know that. We have nowhere else to go right now. And why is that? Sylvia interrupted, her voice tired. Because the renovations on your apartment are never finished? It's weird that it's taken so long. It's almost like it never happened. Of course it has. Marcus was outraged. There were just complications and… Enough lies, Sylvia said tiredly. I know that from the very beginning you planned to stay here forever. Temporarily at first, then gradually push me out, and then what? A nursing home? A little apartment somewhere on the outskirts, out of sight, while you split Richard's inheritance? Mother! Marcus looked genuinely shocked, but Sylvia couldn't believe his reactions anymore. How can you think that way about us? How could you even suggest that? How am I supposed to think that? Sylvia asked, after everything that had happened in these months, after what happened today. She touched her cheek again, still burning from the blow. Serafina looked at her without a shadow of remorse, only with cold calculation in her eyes. If you don't leave today, Sylvia said, straightening to her full height, her voice ringing with newfound resolve, I'll change Richard's will. It was a random shot, but it hit the target. Sylvia saw Serafina flinch, and Marcus turn even paler. Mother, let's not talk about these things, Marcus said conciliatory. We're all tired and upset. Why don't we postpone this conversation until tomorrow, when we've all calmed down? No, Sylvia shook her head. I won't. Not after Richard's daughter hit me and you just stood there and watched. She turned and headed for the door. Where are you going? Marcus asked, his voice laced with disbelief. To Orion Proud, Sylvia answered without turning around. My attorney. Now? Marcus asked incredulously. Mother, it's Sunday night. He won't be. He will come, Sylvia said firmly. Orion always comes when I call him. It was true. Orion Proud wasn't just her attorney. He'd been a family friend for decades, someone Richard trusted implicitly, and the only one who knew everything about their finances and legal affairs. Sylvia left the room, leaving Marcus and Serafina in stunned silence. Walking up to her study, she closed the door and sank into her armchair, feeling the strength suddenly leave her. Her hand went to her cheek again, and she was surprised to find tears streaming down her face. But they weren't tears of pain or fear. They were tears of determination. Serafina's slap hadn't just been a physical blow. It had been the last straw, a moment of piercing clarity. Now Sylvia knew exactly what she had to do. She reached for the phone and dialed Orion's number. Orion didn't arrive right away. He called, apologized, and said he couldn't be at her place until tomorrow morning. "Don't make any decisions in haste, Sylvia," he advised in his measured, soothing voice. Sylvia promised to wait until morning, but she didn't promise not to think. Night enveloped her mansion like an inky cloud. Sylvia lay in her bed, listening to the sounds of the house, the creak of the floorboards, the rhythmic ticking of the antique clock in the hallway, the distant hum of the heating system. All these sounds, so familiar and comforting, now seemed alienated, as if the house were turning away from her, preferring the new, unwelcome occupants. She got up, threw on her robe, and went to the window. Kensington was asleep, with only sparse windows glowing in the darkness and the street lamps casting ghostly circles of light on the sidewalk. Somewhere out there, beyond those walls, was another world, a world Sylvia had once felt confident in, a world that now seemed distant and inaccessible. Her cheek was still throbbing slightly from the slap, not so much from the physical pain. The blow hadn't been hard, but from the humiliation, from the searing realization that Richard's daughter had dared to raise her hand against her, and Richard's son hadn't stood up for her. How did they get to this point? Where had Sylvia taken a wrong turn that Marcus had grown so indifferent? She opened the drawer of her bedside table and pulled out an old photo album in a worn leather binding. Richard had always made fun of her habit of keeping physical photos in the digital age. "Why do you need those dusty albums when you can store thousands of pictures on your computer?" he'd asked. But Sylvia had always believed that real photos, the ones you could hold in your hands, had a special magic. They stored not only the images but also the touch and emotions of those who held them. The first picture in the album was of Richard Bolton her on their wedding day. Sylvia in a simple white lace dress, Richard in a dark suit, both so young, so full of hope. It was the year 1968. Sylvia was only 21. Richard was 26. He was just beginning his diplomatic career. Sylvia was finishing her university studies, specializing in art history. They met at an exhibition of French Impressionists. Sylvia was standing in front of a Monet painting, completely absorbed in the play of light and color, when she heard a deep voice with a slight, charming accent. I wonder what he really saw. These patches of color? Or a complete image? She turned and saw a tall man with attentive gray eyes and a slight, engaging smile. They talked until the gallery closed, then continued on to a nearby cafe, and by the end of the evening, Sylvia knew she had met the man she wanted to spend the rest of her life with. Richard wasn't just a diplomat. He was a Renaissance man, interested in art, literature, and philosophy. From him, Sylvia learned about political intrigue in the corridors of power, the intricacies of international relations, and the art of compromise. In return, she opened up the world of antiques to him, taught him to see the history captured in objects, to understand the language of form and material. She turned the page. Here they were in Paris, where Richard got his first serious assignment. Sylvia was wearing a wide-brimmed hat, laughing, and he had his arm around her shoulders. They were so happy in those years, so full of enthusiasm. Sylvia got a job at a small gallery on the left bank, where she gave tours to tourists and helped with art appraisals. In the evenings, they wandered the narrow streets of Paris, dined in small bistros, and dreamed of the future. It was in Paris that Sylvia realized she was pregnant. Richard was on a business trip to Brussels when she got the results of the tests. She couldn't wait for him to return and called him from the doctor's office. "We're having a baby," Sylvia said, and there was a pause on the receiver. For a moment, Sylvia was afraid he wasn't happy, but then she heard his voice breaking with excitement. "Sylvia, this is the most wonderful news in the world." The next picture was of Sylvia in a hospital room with a tiny bundle in her arms. Marcus was born on a crisp autumn morning after a long 18 hours of labor. Richard was by her side the whole time, holding her hand, telling her she was the strongest woman he knew. As the nurse placed their son on Sylvia's chest, she saw tears streaming down Richard's face. "He's beautiful," he whispered, gently touching Marcus's tiny hand. They'd named him Marcus, in honor of Richard's grandfather, an explorer who'd spent half his life studying Middle Eastern cultures. Richard hoped his son would inherit his passion for learning, his curiosity about the world. In a way, that's what happened. Marcus was always an inquisitive child, but his interests lay on a different plane. He loved constructors, could spend hours building complex structures out of blocks, and as he grew older, he started drawing buildings, bridges, skyscrapers, castles. Sylvia flipped through a few pages. Here's Marcus on his first bicycle, with a big smile and skinned knees. Here they are as a family in Venice. Marcus is about 10, feeding pigeons in Piazza San Marco. Here's his elementary school graduation. He's standing proudly erect, diploma in hand, and Richard and Sylvia are on either side of him, so proud, so happy. The life of a diplomat meant constant traveling. In the first 15 years of Marcus's life, they changed 5 countries: Paris, Rome, Cairo, London again, then Tokyo. Each move was a new challenge for him, a new school, new friends, a new language. Sylvia could see how hard it was for him, how he withdrew into himself after each farewell to another friend. Richard said it builds character, teaches you to adapt, but Sylvia was worried. Maybe that's when she started overprotecting him, trying to compensate for the instability of their life. When Marcus turned 16, Richard and Sylvia made a difficult decision. Richard was assigned to Singapore, but Sylvia decided to stay in London with Marcus so that he could finish school without changing the educational system before going to university. It was the beginning of their two-home life. Richard would visit when he could. Marcus and Sylvia would fly over for vacations, but most of the time, Sylvia was alone with her teenage son. She stopped at a photograph taken at the time. Marcus is in the uniform of a prestigious private school, Sylvia next to him, and they are standing in front of this very house, her current home, which they bought when they decided to settle in London. Richard is not in the picture. He was taking pictures during one of his short visits. These were difficult years. Marcus was going through a turbulent teenage period, and Sylvia was trying to combine being a single mother with developing her own career. By then, she had already established herself as an antiques expert, specializing in miniatures and 18th century decorative arts. She worked as a consultant in several auction houses, wrote articles for specialized magazines, began to build her own collection. There was always enough money. Richard's salary was decent, and Sylvia's income from consulting was gradually growing. But time was woefully short. She missed parent-teacher conferences because of the auctions. She couldn't always help Marcus with his homework, and she was often too tired for the long conversations he probably wanted to have with her. She compensated for this financially. If Marcus expressed interest in something, Sylvia immediately bought it, whether it was an expensive designer, computer, games, or art classes. When he wanted to go with the class on a field trip to Rome, Sylvia not only paid for the trip, but also organized for him and his friends a private tour of close-to-tourist parts of the Vatican, using Richard's connections. On Marcus's 18th birthday, Sylvia gave him his first car, not the most expensive, but prestigious and stylish. Richard thought it was overkill, that they were spoiling the boy, but Sylvia insisted he deserves the best, she said then, and Richard relented, as he almost always did when it came to Marcus. Sylvia turned a few more pages. Here was Marcus receiving his diploma from the Architectural Association, one of the most prestigious schools of architecture in the world. Richard and Sylvia were both present at the ceremony, proud and touched. Marcus was glowing, holding the diploma for which they paid a considerable sum. Then came his first steps into the profession. Sylvia used all her connections to help him get a job with a good architectural firm. Richard had retired by then, and they were finally living together again in this very house. Marcus would often come over for dinner, talking about his projects, his colleagues, his ambitions. He dreamed of opening his own studio, and Richard and Sylvia discussed how they could help him financially. And then Serafina showed up. Sylvia flipped through the album to a picture from their wedding. Marcus in a tuxedo, Serafina in a lush white dress that Sylvia now realized cost more than they could afford. They met at a fundraiser sponsored by Marcus's architectural firm. Serafina worked in public relations, organizing events for wealthy clients. She was, and still is, a beautiful woman, tall, slender, with impeccable taste and impeccable manners. At least, that's how it seemed at first. Richard immediately disliked her. "There's something false about her," he said to Sylvia after the first meeting. But Sylvia brushed aside his misgivings. She saw how happy Marcus was, how he blossomed around her, became more confident. And then, Serafina was really charming, interested in Sylvia's collections, listened to Richard's stories about the diplomatic service, brought small gifts when she came to dinner. The wedding was lavish and expensive. Richard and Sylvia paid most of the expenses, though Serafina insisted on certain details that increased the budget considerably. "It's a once-in-a-lifetime thing," she said, and Sylvia agreed, though Richard frowned as he looked over the bills. After the wedding, they'd given them a substantial sum for a down payment on an apartment, the very apartment that was supposedly still being renovated. Sylvia closed the album and put it back in the nightstand. The last pictures were too painful. Richard in a hospital room, gaunt but still trying to smile. His diagnosis came as a thunderclap to them. Pancreatic cancer, late stage. 6 months, a year tops, the doctor said, avoiding looking them in the eye. Richard lived 8 months. 8 months of gradual fading, pain that was increasingly difficult to control, and talk, endless talk about the past, about the future, about what really mattered. "Take care of Marcus," he told Sylvia one of the last days, "but don't let him or anyone else run your life. You're stronger than you think, Sylvia." Sylvia wasn't sure of that then. When Richard was gone, she felt lost, devastated. Marcus and Serafina had supported her for the first few weeks, but then went back to their lives. Sylvia immersed herself in her work, spending her days at auctions and appraisals trying to fill the void. And then, 6 months ago, they showed up on her doorstep with suitcases and announced renovations to their apartment. Sylvia was glad for the company, glad to have family around her again. How quickly that joy turned to bitterness. Sylvia walked over to the window. The sky was beginning to lighten, the pre-dawn twilight coloring the horizon a soft pink. She'd spent all night reminiscing, and now that morning was inexorably approaching, she saw everything with piercing clarity. She had always given too much to Marcus and demanded too little in return. She had compensated for his lack of time with money and gifts, allowed him to think the world existed for his convenience. She'd created a man who thinks he owes everyone, who sees nothing wrong with his wife insulting and humiliating his stepmother. And Sylvia realized now that Richard was right, there was always something false about her, something predatory. She saw Marcus not so much as a husband, but as a means of access to their fortune, to this house, to the life she thought she deserved. The ringing of the phone snapped Sylvia out of her musings. It was Orion, informing her that he would be at her place in an hour. Sylvia showered, dressed, and went down to the kitchen to make tea. The house was quiet. Marcus and Serafina must still be asleep, or avoiding her. It didn't matter. Her decision had been made. When she heard the doorbell ring, Sylvia felt the strange calm that comes with complete clarity. She knew what she had to do, and she was prepared for the consequences. Doris, faithful Doris, ushered Orion into Sylvia's study. He walked in, tall and straight, despite his 70-plus years, carrying a scuffed leather briefcase that Sylvia remembered seemingly all her life. "Good morning, Sylvia," he said, and his deep voice was like an anchor in the raging sea of her emotions. "You wanted to see me on urgent business?" "Yes, Orion," Sylvia replied, pointing to the chair across from her. "I want to change Richard's will." Orion Proud sat comfortably in the chair opposite Sylvia, resting his old-fashioned leather briefcase on his lap. The morning light streaming in through the high windows of her study emphasized the deep wrinkles on his face, a map of a long life of experience and wisdom. "Change the will," he repeated thoughtfully, showing neither surprise nor disapproval. "May I ask what prompted this decision?" Sylvia touched her cheek, which still held the ghostly sensation of yesterday's slap. "There was an incident yesterday," she began, trying to speak calmly and objectively, as if she were talking about someone else's life. Richard's daughter, Seraphina, slapped me in the face during a family dinner. His son, Marcus, did not stand up for me. In fact, he justified her actions. Orion tilted his head slightly, his gaze sharper. That's a serious accusation, Sylvia. It's not an accusation, Orion. It's a fact. Sylvia straightened in her chair. And it's just the culmination of months of humiliation and neglect on their part. They moved into my house 6 months ago, ostensibly temporarily because of, quote, renovations to their apartment. Since then, Seraphina has been methodically trying to force me out of my own life, changing the furnishings without my permission, bossing around my staff, humiliating me in front of my guests. Sylvia stopped, feeling the anger rising inside her again. She took a deep breath. She'd spent a sleepless night thinking about her life, about her relationship with Marcus. She realized she'd always indulged him too much, always given more than she demanded in return. And the result, she now saw, was a man who could watch his wife insult his stepmother and see nothing wrong with it. Orion listened without interrupting, his face impassive, but Sylvia could see understanding and sympathy in his eyes. "I understand your feelings, Sylvia," he said at last, his voice gentle. "But changing a will is a serious step. Are you sure you're not making this decision in a state of emotional distress?" "I've never been so sure of anything," Sylvia answered firmly. "It's not an impulsive reaction, Orion. It's the result of much thought. I don't want Richard's inheritance to go to people who don't respect me and everything I've created with him." Orion nodded and opened his briefcase, taking out a notepad and pen. "In that case, let's discuss the details. What are your wishes for the new will?" Sylvia walked over to the window, looking out at the morning Kensington, peaceful, elegant, timeless. The view always soothed her, reminding her of continuity, of how life goes on even after us. "My home," she began, turning to Orion. "I don't want Marcus and Seraphina to have it. I want it to go to the city, to be a museum and estate, a Victorian mansion with original furnishings, and a collection of antiques. I think it would be interesting and educational for the public." Orion recorded her words without commenting. "As for my collection of antiques," Sylvia continued, "I want to leave most of it to Eliza Crane." "Eliza?" Orion raised his eyebrows. "Your neighbor?" "Yes," Sylvia smiled, thinking of the young woman who had become closer to her than Richard's own children in recent years. "She's a talented restorer, with a deep understanding and respect for the past. She will appreciate these things not only for their material value, but for the history they hold." Sylvia walked back to her chair and sat down, gathering her thoughts. "I also want to leave her the little cottage in Surrey, the one I inherited from Aunt Vivian. Eliza has always dreamed of having her own workshop in the country, where she could work in peace and quiet." Orion nodded, making notes. "And the funds, as I recall, we're talking about a considerable sum, including Richard's inheritance, and your own savings from your work as an expert." Sylvia sighed. This was the most difficult question of all. Despite all the pain and disappointment, Marcus was still Richard's son, his flesh and blood. To completely disinherit him seemed too cruel. "I want the bulk of it to go toward a scholarship fund for art students," she said after a pause. "The Richard Caldwell Fund. He always believed in the power of education, in the décolleté, importance of supporting young talent." Sylvia paused again, inwardly struggling with conflicting feelings. "To Marcus and Seraphina, I leave a small monthly allowance, enough to live comfortably but not luxuriously. And Marcus's personal belongings, which are still stored here, his childhood drawings, school awards, family photo albums. It all belongs to him by right. But there's a condition," she added, her voice hardening. "This maintenance will be paid only on the condition that they never set foot in my house again. Not in my lifetime, not after my death." Orion looked up from his notebook, his gaze serious and attentive. "Do you realize that such a stipulation could be challenged in a court of law?" "Let them try," Sylvia replied bitterly. "You have a recording of our conversation from last night where I mentioned the slap incident. I'm sure Doris would also be willing to testify about what happened. Besides," Sylvia smiled slightly, "I'm not going to die anytime soon, Orion. I still have time to make sure Richard's will is legally flawless. Orion nodded and continued making notes. When he was done, he looked up and asked, "Is there anything else you would like to include in your will?" Sylvia thought for a moment. "Yes, a small item. I want my collection of Chinese porcelain, the one that Serafina so unceremoniously put away in the pantry, to be displayed in the main living room of the museum, with a plaque explaining its history and significance." It was a petty gesture, Sylvia knew, but she couldn't help herself. A small, posthumous revenge for all the humiliation she'd had to endure. Orion closed the notebook and tucked it away in his briefcase. "I'll have all the necessary paperwork ready by tomorrow, but let me give you some advice, not as a lawyer, but as a friend who has known you and your family for many years. Decisions like this can lead to an irreversible breakdown in a relationship. Are you sure you want that?" Sylvia looked at the picture of Richard on her desk, at his smart, kind face that had always been her compass in difficult times. "The breakup has already happened, Orion," she said quietly. "Yesterday, when Marcus was silent, when his wife slapped me across the face, I'm just formalizing it legally." Orion nodded, accepting her decision. He stood up, about to leave, but stopped at the door. "You mentioned the formal reading of the will. It's an unusual practice these days. Are you sure you want it?" "Absolutely," Sylvia replied. "I want them to hear every word, every condition. I want to see their faces when they realize the consequences of their actions." After Orion left, Sylvia stayed in the study, feeling strangely empty. The decision had been made, the mechanism had been set in motion, but it didn't feel any better. She still felt the pain of betrayal, the bitterness of realizing that Richard's son was capable of such callousness. The sound of the front door opening brought her out of her reverie. Light footsteps, Doris's voice greeting someone, and then the familiar melodious laughter of Eliza. Sylvia stepped out of the study and down the hall. Eliza stood there, bright as ever in her colorful dress, with her hair gathered in a careless bun and a smile that always warmed Sylvia's heart. "Sylvia!" Eliza rushed to her, embracing her with the directness that had always charmed Sylvia. "I brought those books on Japanese lacquer technique I promised. They're amazing, you should." She stopped, noticing the look on Sylvia's face, and her smile changed to concern. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" Sylvia tried to smile, but it wasn't convincing. "Let's go into the conservatory," she suggested. "It would be more comfortable to talk there." The winter garden was Sylvia's favorite place in the house. A bright room with panoramic windows overlooking a small but well-maintained garden. Here, among the lush greenery and the fragrance of flowers, Sylvia always felt closer to nature, to life in its purest form. They sat down in the wicker chairs, and Doris brought them tea. Real Earl Grey, not the herbal concoction Serafina had been pushing so aggressively. "So, what happened?" Eliza asked when Doris left them. "You look exhausted." Sylvia told her about yesterday's incident, about the slap, about Marcus's silence, about her decision to change Richard's will. Eliza listened without interrupting, her usually animated face growing more serious with every word Sylvia said. "My God, Sylvia," she said when Sylvia had finished. "It's awful. How could they do this to you?" Sylvia shook her head, feeling the tears she'd been holding back all morning finally find their way out. "I don't know, Eliza. I thought I knew Richard's son. But now I'm not sure I ever knew him." Eliza moved to the chair beside Sylvia and took her hands in hers. The young, strong hands of a restorer, with light traces of solvents and paint, with short, practical nails. "You don't deserve to be treated like this," she said firmly. "No one does." Sylvia squeezed her hands, grateful for this simple human support. "You know," she said after a pause, "I've included you in Richard's new will." Eliza recoiled, her eyes widening in surprise. "Me? But why?" "Because you deserve it," Sylvia answered simply. "Because you understand the value of the past. Because you respect history and tradition. Because you remind me of myself when I was young, as passionate, as committed to my work. Sylvia didn't tell her the details. It would have seemed tactless, as if she were buying her friendship or gratitude. But the truth was that over the past 2 years, since Eliza had moved in next door and had come to meet Sylvia with a gift of homemade cookies, she had become almost the daughter Sylvia never had. They had met by chance. Eliza rang Sylvia's doorbell to ask if Sylvia minded the construction noise from her house, where she was setting up a workshop. Not only did Sylvia not mind, but she invited Eliza in for tea, intrigued by this young woman with a paint stain on her cheek and a determined look. Over tea, it transpired that Eliza was an antique furniture restorer specializing in the Victorian era. She had studied at the London College of Furniture, then interned at various museums before deciding to start her own business. Sylvia showed her collection, and Eliza's delight was genuine. She saw not only the material value of things but also their history, their character, their soul. She could talk for hours about the marquetry techniques of an 18th-century chest of drawers or the lacquering of a Meiji Japanese table. They saw each other regularly from then on. Eliza often came to Sylvia with questions about restoration, showed Sylvia photos of her work, and asked for advice. Sylvia shared her knowledge, her contacts in the world of antiques, and her stories with her. Sometimes they went to auctions or exhibitions together. Watching Eliza at such times was pure pleasure. Her enthusiasm, her knowledge, her ability to see the beauty in details that most people just didn't notice. Gradually, their relationship grew from professional to personal. They talked not only about antiques but also about life, about their joys and sorrows. Eliza told about her childhood in a small town in the north, about her parents who did not understand her passion for old things, about an unsuccessful affair with an artist who was more interested in her connections than in herself. Sylvia shared memories of life with Richard, of the difficulties of raising a child while constantly moving, of her professional triumphs and failures. Eliza listened with genuine interest, asked questions, and offered her perspective. Fresh, young, but always respectful of Sylvia's experience. After Richard's death, it was Eliza who was there for her, supporting her not with loud words of sympathy, but with a quiet presence, practical help, and the ability to distract Sylvia from her gloomy thoughts with conversations about art and beauty. When Marcus and Serafina moved in with Sylvia, her meetings with Eliza became less frequent, partly because Serafina made it quite clear that she thought their friendship was strange and inappropriate. "What could you possibly have in common with that girl?" she asked with a slight sneer. "Aren't we the ones you should be spending your time with?" But they still found ways to see each other. On days when Marcus and Serafina were away on business, or at a cafe nearby, or in Eliza's studio, where Sylvia could watch her work for hours, marveling at the precision of her movements, her patience, her respect for the material. "I don't know what to say," Eliza's voice brought Sylvia back to reality. I didn't think." "You don't need to say anything," Sylvia replied softly. "I don't expect thanks or any special words, I just wanted you to know." Eliza shook her head, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It's not about gratitude, Sylvia. It's just, you mean so much to me. More than just a mentor or a friend. She hesitated, searching for words. "You showed me that I could be what I wanted to be, that my passion for old things wasn't an oddity but a calling. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." Tears were now streaming down her cheeks, and Sylvia reached up to wipe them away. "You remind me of the daughter I never had," Sylvia said quietly. "Smart, talented, with a heart open to beauty and history. You deserve everything I can give you." They sat like that for a few minutes in silence, broken only by the birds singing in the garden and the distant noise of the city. Then Eliza straightened up, wiped away her tears, and smiled that bright, determined smile that was her trademark. "What are you going to do next?" she asked, her voice steady. "With Marcus and Serafina, I mean?" Sylvia sighed, coming back to a reality that was far less pleasant than their conversation. "Orion is preparing the paperwork. Tomorrow we'll have the formal reading of Richard's will. I want them to hear every word, every stipulation." "That won't be easy," Eliza remarked. "They probably won't take it well." No doubt, Sylvia agreed. There will be yelling, accusations, maybe even threats. But I'm ready for it. I no longer have any illusions about their true nature. She felt the resolve that had sustained her all morning strengthen again. Yes, it will be difficult. Yes, it will be painful. But it is necessary, not only as an act of justice but as an act of self-respect. Will you be there for me? Sylvia asked Eliza. Tomorrow? During the announcement? She nodded without hesitation. Of course, I'll be there, for as long as it takes. Sylvia squeezed her hand, grateful for that unconditional support. In a world where even Richard's own son could betray her, that kind of loyalty was priceless. Thank you, she said simply, for everything. They finished their tea and Eliza left, promising to return tomorrow at the appointed time. Sylvia stayed in the winter garden, watching the light play in the leaves, thinking about the day ahead. Orion called in the evening to say that the papers were ready, and he would arrive at 11 in the morning for the announcement. Sylvia thanked him and asked Doris to tell Marcus and Serafina that their presence in the library at that time was mandatory. Mr. Marcus asked about you, ma'am, Doris said with concern. He looked very worried. Let him worry, Sylvia replied. Tomorrow everything will be clearer. Sylvia spent the evening in her study, looking through old catalogs of auctions she'd participated in, rereading articles she'd written for antiques magazines. This was her life, full of passion, knowledge, discovery, a life that Serafina called stuck in the past. Perhaps she was right about one thing. Sylvia did value the past, but not because she feared the future, but because she saw the past as the foundation for the present, the roots without which the tree cannot stand. When the clock struck midnight, Sylvia closed the last catalog and turned off the lamp. Tomorrow would be a difficult day, and she needed the strength to face it with dignity. As she fell asleep, she thought not of Marcus and Serafina, not of the pain of betrayal or the bitterness of disappointment. She thought of Eliza, of her young, bright face, of her hands carefully restoring the beauty of antique things, of her eyes full of admiration for the craftsmanship of past generations. Perhaps this is the real continuity, not in blood or name, but in a shared passion, in a shared understanding of the value of the past, in a shared respect for history and tradition. And if so, Sylvia realized, she had found her true legacy. The morning of the announcement of the will was unexpectedly clear and sunny, as if nature itself decided to support Sylvia on this difficult day. She woke up early after a surprisingly restful sleep and spent an hour carefully selecting an outfit. She settled on the dark blue suit that Richard had always called her diplomatic attire. It made her look collected, elegant, and most importantly, unyielding. Doris brought breakfast to her room, an unaccustomed luxury Sylvia had allowed herself in order to avoid a premature meeting with Marcus and Serafina. According to Doris, they were both at home, tense and silent, exchanging only brief phrases over breakfast. Mr. Marcus asked about you, ma'am, Doris said, setting the cups down. He wanted to know if you'd changed your mind about the meeting. No, Doris, Sylvia said, buttering her toast. I haven't changed my mind. This meeting is inevitable. Around 10 in the morning, Eliza arrived. She was dressed more formally than usual, in a simple dress of muted green with a minimum of accessories. Her usually loose hair was gathered into a neat bun, making her look more serious and older than her 27 years. Do I look solid enough? She asked with a slight smile, noticing Sylvia's appraising gaze. I wanted to match the importance of the moment. You look beautiful, Sylvia replied sincerely. Thank you for coming. They walked to Sylvia's study, away from prying eyes, and spent the next hour talking quietly about Eliza's latest restoration projects, the V&A exhibition, anything but the upcoming announcement. It was their way of dealing with the tension, talking about normal, everyday things, as if this day was no different. At precisely 11 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Doris escorted Orion Proud into the library, where, at Sylvia's direction, chairs had already been prepared and arranged around a large oak table. The desk where Richard had once written his memoirs where Marcus had done his homework as a child, where Sylvia had spent many hours studying auction catalogs and antiques guides. Eliza and Sylvia walked down to the library, where Orion was already unfolding papers from his worn leather briefcase. He nodded to them, his face serious and collected, the professional mask he wore before important meetings. "Everything is ready," he said quietly. "The paperwork has been drawn up according to your wishes, and is in full compliance with the law." Sylvia nodded and sat in the chair at the head of the table, a position she had held at family councils for decades. Eliza sat to her left, Orion to her right. It was left to wait for Marcus and Serafina. They appeared a few minutes later. Marcus looked tense, but held himself upright with the dignity Richard had taught him. Serafina, on the other hand, seemed agitated and annoyed at the same time. Her gaze slid to Sylvia, then to Eliza, and there was a look of mild contempt on her face. "What is she doing here?" Serafina asked, nodding toward Eliza. "This is a family matter." "Eliza is here at my invitation," Sylvia replied calmly. "Please sit down." Marcus touched Serafina's arm, warning her not to start an argument, and they sat down across from Sylvia and Eliza. There was an awkward pause, which Orion interrupted by clearing his throat. "Thank you all for your presence," he began in a formal tone. "We are here at the request of Mrs. Sylvia Caldwell for the reading of Richard Caldwell's new will, made and signed yesterday, June 8, 2025. Serafina cast a quick glance at Marcus, something akin to triumph flashing in her eyes. They thought Sylvia had called them to tell them she'd decided to sign the house over to them, maybe even to move into that little cottage in Surrey that Serafina had casually mentioned in conversation. "Before we begin," Orion continued, "I would like to point out that Mrs. Caldwell is in perfect health and clear mind, as confirmed by Dr. Harmon's medical report of yesterday. This will is made with full understanding of its implications and in accordance with all legal requirements." Serafina's smile began to fade, and Marcus straightened in his chair, his face tense. "Mother, what's going on?" he asked directly. "What's all this for?" Sylvia looked at Richard's son, the only child she loved more than life, for whom she had sacrificed her dreams and ambitions, to whom she had given the best she had. "Patience, Marcus," she said calmly. "You'll know soon enough." Orion put on his glasses and began to read. "I, Richard David Caldwell, being of sound mind and sound judgment, do hereby revoke and annul all previous wills and dispose of my estate as follows." The faces of Marcus and Serafina gradually changed as Orion read out the clauses of the will. First, bewilderment, then alarm. Then, when he reached the clause about turning the mansion over to the city for an estate museum, pure, unconcealed shock. "Is this some kind of joke?" Serafina interrupted, her voice rising an octave. "You can't be serious." "Please don't interrupt, Mrs. Caldwell," Orion said sternly. "You will have a chance to speak after the entire document has been read." Serafina leaned back in her chair, her face contorted with ill-concealed rage. Marcus sat motionless, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. Orion continued reading. When he reached the paragraph about the transfer of the antiques collection and the cottage in Surrey to Eliza Crane, Serafina couldn't stand it. "To her?" she exclaimed, pointing a trembling finger at Eliza. "You are leaving your precious treasures to this girl who appeared out of nowhere? You're out of your mind." "Serafina," Marcus said warningly, but it was too late. "Don't you dare shut me up." She turned to him, her face red with anger. "Don't you realize what's going on? Your stepmother is disinheriting us in favor of some strange girl. Everything that should have been ours." "Mrs. Caldwell," Orion raised his voice, "I'm going to have to ask you to keep order, or I'll have to interrupt the reading." "To hell with your announcement!" Serafina jumped up from her seat. "This is a farce. That old witch is out of her mind if she thinks she can do this to us." "Serafina, that's enough." Marcus now rose, grabbing her arm. "Stop it, you're making it worse." Sylvia watched the scene with remarkable calm. It was like watching a play in a theater, emotional, but not about her personally. Eliza sat beside her, pale but collected. Her hands slipped discreetly to Sylvia's under the table, and Sylvia squeezed her fingers gratefully. "Maybe we should take a break," Orion suggested, looking at Sylvia. "No," Sylvia replied firmly. "Please continue. I want everything to be said today." Serafina sat down again, glaring at Sylvia with a hateful look. Marcus put a hand on her shoulder, either to soothe her or to keep her from erupting again. Orion continued reading. When he reached the paragraph about the Richard Caldwell Memorial Scholarship Fund, Sylvia noticed Marcus's face tremble. He loved his father, always striving to earn his approval. Did he know how deeply disappointed Richard would be by his current behavior? Finally, Orion reached the last clause, that of monthly maintenance for Marcus and Serafina on the condition that they never cross the threshold of Sylvia's house again. This condition is not negotiable or amendable, Orion read out. Should Marcus David Caldwell or his wife Serafina Marie Caldwell violate this condition, payments will be stopped immediately, and all funds intended for them will be transferred to the aforementioned scholarship fund. There was a silence so profound you could hear the ticking of the antique clock on the mantelpiece. Orion folded the papers and removed his glasses. This concludes the reading of Mr. Richard Caldwell's will. Are there any questions? Questions? Serafina laughed a hoarse, unnatural laugh. I have only one question. How could you allow this? This farce was legalized? She is clearly out of her mind. I have already pointed out, Mrs. Caldwell, that the medical report confirms your stepmother's full capacity, Orion replied calmly. Moreover, as her attorney for over 30 years, I can personally attest to her clarity of mind. This is ridiculous, Serafina turned to Marcus. Say something. This is your father's inheritance. Marcus slowly raised his eyes, and Sylvia saw in them a strange mixture of emotions. Anger, confusion, and maybe even a glimmer of understanding. Mother, he said quietly, addressing Sylvia for the first time since they'd met in the library. Why? Is it because of what happened at lunch? Because of what, Serafina? Don't you dare accuse me, Serafina interrupted him, jumping up again. She started the whole thing. She spilled tea on me on purpose to ruin my dress. That's enough. Sylvia stood up, and everyone stopped talking. I didn't make this decision yesterday or the day before yesterday. It had been maturing in me for months, as I watched you two gradually try to push me out of my own life. Yesterday's incident was just the last straw. Sylvia looked right at Marcus. You are Richard's son, and I will always love you as such. But I can't respect a man who watches silently as his wife insults and humiliates his stepmother. Who justifies a slap in the face by saying I was emotional. Who is willing to betray his family, his heritage, for the sake of what? Modern decor? New china that can be washed in the dishwasher? Marcus lowered his head, unable to meet her gaze. It's your choice, Marcus, Sylvia continued, and these are its consequences. You'll have enough money to live comfortably, but not in luxury, not at my expense, and not in this house that you and your wife so obviously disrespect. Sylvia turned to Serafina, who was looking at her with undisguised hatred. As for you, Serafina, I have nothing to say to you. You have never been a part of this family, not in the sense that matters. You only saw us as a means to your ends, status, money, this house. But you miscalculated. The Caldwells may be too kind, too trusting, but we are not fools, and we don't let anyone raise a hand against us with impunity. Sylvia took Eliza's hand and helped her up. This meeting is over. Orion, thank you for your time and professionalism. Doris will show you out. You can't just leave, Serafina shouted, jumping up again. We're going to contest that will. We'll prove that you're insane. You can try, Orion replied calmly, gathering the documents. But I assure you, this will is legally flawless, and any attempt to challenge it will only lead to a public scandal, which I'm sure is not in your best interests. To hell with my interests, Serafina grabbed one of the documents from the table and tore it in half. I'm not going to let some out-of-her-mind old woman and her little friend take away what is rightfully ours. Serafina, that's enough. Marcus grabbed her hands, trying to calm her down. You're only making it worse. Let me go. She broke free and pointed a trembling finger at Eliza. And you little fraud? You think you can just come and take everything we deserve? Eliza, who had remained silent until now, raised her head and looked directly at Serafina. I asked for nothing and expected nothing, she said quietly but firmly. Sylvia made her own decision, and I respect it, whatever it may be. Hypocrite, Serafina spat out. You've been manipulating her for months, ingratiating yourself with her. Enough. Sylvia's voice, suddenly loud and harsh, silenced everyone. I will not stand by and listen to you insult a person I deeply respect. If you have nothing constructive to say, I suggest you leave this room, and tomorrow this house. Mother. Marcus stepped forward, his voice sounding almost pleading. Let's talk, just you and me. Without Serafina, without… He cast a glance at Eliza, no outsiders. I'm sure we can work this out. No, Marcus. Sylvia shook her head. It's too late to talk. You made your choice when you kept your mouth shut after Serafina slapped me. When you excused her behavior. When you let her slowly push me out of my own home. Sylvia headed for the door, Eliza following her. The documents that will remain in your possession are copies, Orion said, gathering his briefcase. The originals are kept in a safe place. I would advise you to think carefully about your next steps. We left the library, leaving Marcus and Serafina in stunned silence. Orion said goodbye to us in the lobby, promising to be in touch if his help was needed. I felt strangely light, as if I'd shed a heavy weight I'd been carrying for too long. Eliza offered to stay with me, but I declined. I need some time to myself, I said, squeezing her hand. But thank you for your support. You don't know how much it means to me. After she left, I headed for the conservatory, my favorite place in the house, an oasis of calm and beauty. Doris brought me tea, real Earl Grey, strong and fragrant, just the way I like it. I sat in the sedalai, wicker chair, watching the light play in the foliage, enjoying the peace and quiet. For the first time in months, I felt like a mistress in my own home, in my own life. After a while, I heard a noise from the hallway. Serafina's loud, furious voice, interrupted by Marcus's quieter but insistent remarks. The sound of breaking glass, then sobs, hysterical, full of rage and frustration. Hush, dear, we'll find a way, Marcus's voice came to me. We'll talk to a lawyer. Talk about what? Serafina shouted. That old witch has taken everything from us. Everything. And for what? To give it to some random girl and a bunch of unknown students? She's still my stepmother. Marcus's voice sounded tired. And she has the right to dispose of her property as she wishes. She's crazy, sobbed Serafina. And if you can't see that, then you're as crazy as she is. We must fight. We must contest this will. No, Serafina, Marcus said firmly. Orion is right. Any attempt to contest the will only lead to a scandal. We'll get a monthly allowance. That's enough to… Enough? Serafina laughed hysterically. It's crumbs. Handouts. When we could have it all. Her voice trailed off into a shout. Then there was the sound of footsteps, the slam of a door, and then silence again. I took a sip of my tea, surprised at my calmness. I expected to feel pain, bitterness, maybe even regret. But instead, there was only quiet satisfaction at the decision I'd made, and a sense of closure. I knew Marcus and Serafina would be leaving soon. If not today, then tomorrow. I knew they would be angry, perhaps even try to contest the will, despite Orion's warning. But that didn't matter anymore. I had protected what was dear to me. My home, my heritage, my dignity. I sat in the conservatory, quietly sipping tea, listening to Serafina sobbing with rage somewhere in the back of the house, as Marcus tried unsuccessfully to calm her down. It was the end of one chapter of my life, but not life itself. There were many days ahead, filled with new meaning. Working on the museum, socializing with Eliza, perhaps even new acquisitions for my collection. Doris entered with a tray of fresh scones. Is everything all right, ma'am? She asked anxiously. There's so much noise. I'm fine, Doris. I smiled. It's just a storm in a teacup. It'll blow over soon. Doris nodded and went out, and I continued to enjoy my tea, looking at my garden, at my life, which, despite all the losses and disappointments, was still full of beauty and possibilities. After all, as Richard was fond of saying, life is not what happens to you, but what you do with it. So I decided to make the rest of my life meaningful, filled with dignity and freedom from toxic relationships, even if those relationships involved me with Richard's own son. It was a painful decision, but the right one, and sitting in the winter garden, surrounded by silence and beauty, I finally felt at peace with myself and the choices I had made. The next morning, the house felt different, lighter somehow, as if a heavy cloud had finally lifted. Marcus and Serafina were gone. Doris, with her usual quiet efficiency, confirmed it. Their suitcases, hastily packed, had been left by the front door sometime in the early hours. A note, crumpled and barely legible, was found on the kitchen counter, scrawled in Serafina's hand, a furious, disjointed accusation of betrayal and insanity, signed with a flourish that somehow managed to convey both venom and self-pity. Marcus's name was not on it, nor was there any sign of a goodbye from him, just a gaping void where their presence had been, and an unexpected, profound sense of relief. I spent the morning walking through the rooms, rediscovering my home. The silence was no longer oppressive but comforting, filled with the echoes of Richard's laughter, the quiet hum of memories that were finally mine again, untainted by the grating presence of intruders. I ran my hand over the polished surfaces of my antique furniture, paused by the empty space on the buffet where the Limoges china would soon return. Each object seemed to breathe a sigh of relief with me, settling back into its rightful place in the narrative of this house. Orion called mid-morning. "They're gone, then?" he asked, his voice calm. I confirmed it. "Good. As I suspected, they'll likely consult with a lawyer. However, as I explained, Richard's will is robust. Any challenge would be expensive and, frankly, unlikely to succeed without genuine grounds. It would only serve to air their grievances publicly, which, as I pointed out, is not in their best interests." We discussed the next steps for the museum conversion, the legal technicalities, the process of inventorying the collection. It was a complex undertaking, but for the first time it felt like an exciting new chapter, not a burden. Later that afternoon, Eliza arrived, her eyes bright with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "They really left?" she asked, a hint of awe in her voice. I nodded, leading her into the living room, where sunlight streamed through the tall windows. "It's quiet, isn't it?" I observed, a genuine smile gracing my lips. "It's peaceful," Eliza corrected, looking around the room with an appraising eye. "It feels like you're home again, Sylvia." We talked for hours, sitting by the fireplace, sipping tea, and making plans. Eliza, with her boundless energy and deep knowledge of restoration, was already brimming with ideas for the museum. We discussed potential exhibits, educational programs for art students, even a small cafe that could serve visitors. It was invigorating, a creative spark reigniting a part of me that I thought had gone dormant after Richard's death. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity, but it was a joyful whirlwind. Orion's team began the meticulous process of formalizing the museum transfer. Specialists came to assess the house's structural integrity and historical significance. I worked closely with Eliza, meticulously going through my collections, selecting pieces for display, recounting the stories behind each acquisition. We laughed, we debated, we shared meals prepared by a humming Doris, who seemed to have a renewed spring in her step. One afternoon, while sorting through a collection of 19th-century French miniatures, I found a small, worn wooden box tucked away at the bottom of a drawer. Inside, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, were a handful of Marcus's childhood drawings. A lopsided house with a smoke curling from its chimney, a crude but endearing sketch of Richard and me holding hands, a fantastical drawing of a skyscraper reaching for the stars. A pang of sadness, sharp and unexpected, pierced through my newfound peace. Despite everything, this was Richard's son, a boy I had once loved fiercely, whose triumphs I had celebrated, whose failures I had tried to cushion. The bitterness of his betrayal and his silence still stung. I placed the drawings gently back into the box, sealing them away. They were his personal belongings, as per the will, to be given to him if he ever chose to claim them. I wondered if he ever would. Vas moi ki biag kai fi. Life settled into a new rhythm, a rhythm of purpose and quiet satisfaction. The house, once a silent monument to grief, was slowly transforming into a vibrant hub of history and art. The local historical society and several art foundations expressed immense enthusiasm for the future Caldwell House Museum. Preliminary discussions began for opening its doors to the public in about a year, after extensive conservation work and the careful curation of exhibits. I found myself attending meetings, giving interviews to local newspapers, and even reconnecting with old colleagues from the art world who were eager to contribute their expertise. My relationship with Eliza blossomed into an even deeper bond. She was more than just a colleague or a friend. She was the kindred spirit I never realized I was missing. She spent countless hours in the house, her energy infectious, her passion for preserving the past mirroring my own. We pored over architectural plans, debated the optimal lighting for a particular tapestry, and shared countless cups of Doris's strong Earl Grey. She moved some of her workshop equipment into the Surrey cottage, turning it into a charming, functional space, a place where she could truly create. It filled me with a quiet joy to see her so happy, so absorbed in her craft. One crisp autumn morning, a thick envelope arrived. The return address was a prestigious London law firm. My heart gave a little flutter, recognizing the inevitable. It was from Marcus and Seraphina's lawyers. They were indeed contesting Richard's will. The letter, drafted in cold, formal legal language, accused me of undue influence, of being of unsound mind, and claimed that the new will was a malicious attempt to disinherit Richard's rightful heirs. It was exactly as Orion had predicted. I took the letter to Orion's office the same day. He read it calmly, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Standard procedure," he confirmed, placing it on his desk. "As expected. Rest assured, Sylvia, we have all our ducks in a row. Your medical assessment, Richard's clear wishes expressed to me over many years, and, frankly, their own behavior, which can be presented as proof of their unsuitability to manage a cultural institution like this." He paused, then looked at me. "Are you prepared for this to become public, Sylvia? For the details of their behavior to be revealed in court?" I took a deep breath. "Yes, Orion, I am. Richard would want his legacy protected. And so do I." The thought of the public scrutiny, the headlines, was daunting, but the alternative, allowing Marcus and Seraphina to destroy everything Richard and I had built, was unbearable. This was a battle for my dignity, for Richard's memory, and for the future of the Caldwell house. The legal proceedings began, slowly at first, then picking up momentum. There were preliminary hearings, exchanges of documents, and a growing buzz in the local media. Articles appeared, detailing the escalating family dispute, painting me either as a brave widow fighting for her late husband's wishes, or as a bitter old woman disinheriting her stepchildren. The truth, as always, was far more nuanced, but headlines thrive on drama, not subtlety. During this tumultuous period, I realized how truly isolated I had become, save for Doris and Eliza. Many of Richard's old friends, even some of my own, chose to distance themselves, unwilling to be drawn into such a messy family affair. Some offered platitudes of sympathy, others subtly hinted that it might be kinder to settle. But Eliza remained steadfast. She was my rock, my confidant, and my unwavering ally. Her presence, her quiet strength, reminded me that I was not alone in this fight. The day of the first major court hearing arrived, crisp and cold, mirroring the tension that had settled deep in my bones. I dressed in my dark blue diplomatic suit, a silent armor. Eliza was there, her hand firm on my arm as we entered the grand courthouse. Orion was already waiting, his demeanor calm and reassuring. Marcus and Seraphina were there too, sitting on the opposite side of the courtroom. Marcus looked strained, his usual composure fractured by visible anxiety. Seraphina, however, radiated a brittle defiance, her eyes darting around the room, settling on me with a venomous glare. She wore an expensive, tailored suit, perhaps a deliberate attempt to project an image of respectability, but it couldn't mask the fury simmering beneath the surface. The courtroom was packed with journalists, curious onlookers, and a few familiar faces, some sympathetic, some merely morbidly curious. The judge, a stern-faced woman with an air of absolute authority, called the case. The lawyers for Marcus and Serafina began their arguments, painting a picture of an elderly, vulnerable widow who had been unduly influenced by a cunning younger woman, Eliza, and who, in a fit of irrational anger, had made a will that betrayed her late husband's true intentions for his children. They presented fabricated evidence of my supposed mental decline, quoting out-of-context remarks and exaggerating my age-related minor ailments. Serafina's lawyer dramatically recounted the tea-spilling incident, twisting it into a deliberate act of aggression on my part. Then it was Orion's turn. He meticulously dismantled their claims, point by point. He presented Dr. Harmon's medical report, unequivocally stating my sound mental health. He brought forth Richard's own meticulously kept journals, which contained entries expressing his desire for his legacy to benefit the arts and the public, hinting at his growing disillusionment with his children's materialistic tendencies. Orion also read excerpts from Richard's previous wills, showing a consistent pattern of philanthropic intent, with only modest provisions for Marcus and Serafina, a testament to Richard's belief in them forging their own paths, not relying on inherited wealth. But the most impactful moment came when Orion called Doris to testify. Doris, despite her usual timid nature, spoke with quiet dignity and unwavering honesty. She recounted Serafina's increasingly overbearing behavior, the systematic changes to the house, the condescending remarks, and finally, the slap. Her voice, though soft, carried throughout the silent courtroom as she described Serafina's fury and my subsequent shock and humiliation. When she described Marcus's inaction, a palpable tension filled the room. Then, Orion played the audio recording from that fateful night, my conversation with Marcus and Serafina after the dinner party. Their voices, raw with anger and frustration, filled the courtroom, exposing their true intentions. Their plans to send me to a nursing home, their contempt for my cherished possessions, their brazen admission that the house was merely a means to an end, Serafina's harsh laugh, Marcus's weak protestations. It was all laid bare. The effect was devastating. Gasps rippled through the audience. Marcus's face turned an ashen gray, and Serafina looked as though she wanted the floor to swallow her whole. My own testimony was brief, but firm. I spoke of Richard's love for this house, his passion for art and history, his belief in leaving a lasting legacy beyond mere monetary inheritance. I spoke of my grief, yes, but also of my newfound resolve to protect what Richard held dear. I explained my reasons for the changes to the will, not as an act of spite, but as an act of protection and preservation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As the hearing progressed, the tide clearly turned. The public perception shifted dramatically, aided by sympathetic news reports that highlighted the emotional testimony and the stark contrast between my calm dignity and Serafina's outbursts. The accusations of my unsound mind crumbled under the weight of medical evidence and my own articulate testimony. The narrative of undue influence also withered, replaced by the clear picture of a woman asserting her rightful autonomy and protecting her late husband's true legacy. Marcus and Serafina's legal team, seeing their case weaken, became increasingly desperate, resorting to more personal attacks, trying to paint Eliza as a gold digger. Eliza, however, maintained her composure, her quiet strength and genuine passion for her work shining through. Her testimony, devoid of any pretense, focused on her deep respect for my collection and her vision for the museum. She spoke eloquently about the historical significance of the house and its contents, framing it not as a personal inheritance, but as a cultural responsibility. The judge, after hearing all the arguments and reviewing the extensive evidence, delivered her preliminary ruling a few weeks later. She found no evidence of undue influence or mental incapacity. She acknowledged the validity of Richard's will and my right to dispose of my assets as I saw fit. While a final, definitive ruling on the contestation would take more time, the judge strongly advised Marcus and Serafina to reconsider their legal pursuit, citing the overwhelming evidence against them and the likely high costs of continuing. It was a resounding victory for me. The news spread rapidly. The court's decision effectively validated Richard's last wishes and, more importantly, my authority. Marcus and Serafina, facing mounting legal bills and public scorn, finally ceased their active challenge. There was no formal apology, no attempt at reconciliation, just a bitter, resentful silence that settled between us. Their monthly allowance began to be paid into their account, a constant, tangible reminder of their diminished standing, and the condition that they never step foot in the house again. I knew they wouldn't. The house, once their prize, was now a monument to their defeat. Manu Hungel with the legal battle behind me, the work on the Caldwell House Museum accelerated. Eliza became my right hand, her enthusiasm boundless. We spent our days immersing ourselves in the collections, meticulously cataloging each piece, tracing its history, and planning its place within the museum's narrative. The grand living room, where Serafina had proudly displayed her exclusive design vase, was painstakingly restored to its original splendor. And in a place of honor, on a beautifully restored pedestal, sat my beloved Chinese porcelain collection, each piece gleaming, with a discreet plaque detailing its provenance and significance. A subtle victorious wink to Serafina's earlier dismissal. Local schools and universities expressed keen interest in the future Richard Caldwell Scholarship Fund for art students. I started meeting with prospective candidates, bright young minds eager to pursue their artistic passions. It was incredibly fulfilling, a direct and tangible way to honor Richard's belief in education and talent, turning his legacy into a living, breathing force for good. My days were now filled with purpose and meaningful connection. My bond with Eliza deepened with every shared project and every quiet conversation. Doris, my faithful housekeeper, delighted in the renewed sense of order and purpose in the house, bustling about with a cheerful hum. Even my social circle, thinned by the legal battle, began to slowly rebuild with people who genuinely valued my company and my passion, not my perceived wealth or influence. One quiet evening, as I sat in the conservatory, listening to the soft rustle of leaves in the garden, I felt a profound sense of peace wash over me. The pain of betrayal still lingered, a faint scar on my heart, but it no longer dominated my life. I had faced down adversity, protected Richard's legacy, and reclaimed my own life with dignity and strength. The house, my sanctuary, was now destined to become a sanctuary for others, a place of beauty, history, and learning. And I, Sylvia Caldwell, was finally truly at home, not just in this house but within myself. The opening day of the Richard Caldwell House Museum was a triumph. The sun shone brilliantly, casting long, elegant shadows across the newly manicured lawns. A red ribbon, stretched across the grand front entrance, shimmered in the morning light. Dignitaries from the city council, prominent figures from the art world, and countless curious members of the public gathered, their excited murmurs filling the air. Eliza stood proudly by my side, a radiant smile on, her face, her hand resting reassuringly on my arm. Orion, stately and dignified, stood slightly behind us, a quiet sentinel of justice served. As I stepped forward to address the crowd, a profound sense of gratitude swelled within me. I spoke of Richard's vision, his love for history and art, and his desire for this house to be a place of education and inspiration. I spoke of the journey, not dwelling on the painful parts, but highlighting the resilience, the determination, and the unwavering support that had made this dream a reality. I spoke of Eliza's invaluable contribution, her dedication and passion, and I spoke of Doris, whose unwavering loyalty had been a quiet anchor through the storm. When I cut the ribbon, a cheer erupted, and the crowd surged forward, eager to explore the magnificent interior. I watched them wander through the rooms, their eyes wide with appreciation for the antique furnishings, the curated collections, the stories that each object held. I saw families with children, eager students sketching in their notebooks, and older couples quietly reminiscing in the library. My Chinese porcelain, gleaming under spotlights in the main living room, drew admiring glances, a subtle vindication of its worth. The Richard Caldwell Scholarship Fund also had its inaugural ceremony a few weeks later. 6 bright, talented art students, chosen for their exceptional promise and passion, were awarded scholarships that would allow them to pursue their dreams without financial burden. Meeting them, seeing the hope and excitement in their eyes, was profoundly moving. It was a living testament to Richard's enduring legacy, a way for his spirit to continue fostering beauty and knowledge in the world. My days now were rich and fulfilling. I continued to be deeply involved with the museum, overseeing new acquisitions, advising on exhibits, and occasionally giving tours myself, sharing the personal stories behind the collections. Eliza was appointed the museum's head conservator, a role she embraced with boundless energy and innovation. Her workshop in the Surrey cottage flourished, and her reputation as a restorer grew exponentially. We often had dinner together in the conservatory, sharing stories of our days, planning future projects, and simply enjoying each other's company. Doris, of course, was an integral part of this new chapter, overseeing the house with pride, and often sharing a quiet cup of tea with me as we watched the sunset over the garden. Sometimes, a fleeting thought of Marcus and Seraphina would cross my mind. I heard through the grapevine that their legal attempts had truly ended, and they were living a far less extravagant life, reliant on their monthly allowance, unable to achieve the grand ambitions Seraphina had always harbored. There was no joy in their misfortune, only a quiet sadness for the path they had chosen, for the family bond that had been irrevocably severed by their own actions and greed. I had offered them a comfortable life, a dignified existence, but they had chosen a different path, one defined by envy and entitlement. I often thought of Richard, his wise counsel, his unwavering love. He had taught me that true wealth wasn't just in possessions, but in purpose, in legacy, in the connections we forge. He had also reminded me, in his last days, to be strong, to live my own life, not to let anyone run it. And, in reclaiming my home, my dignity, and his true legacy, I had finally, truly, understood what he meant. The sting of betrayal had faded, replaced by a deep, enduring sense of peace. My house, my life, was finally my own again, and it was beautiful. Months turned into a year, and the Caldwell House Museum thrived. It became a beloved institution, drawing visitors from across London and beyond. School groups regularly toured the period rooms, marveling at the preserved Victorian elegance, while art history students delved into the specialized collections, finding inspiration for their own studies. The Richard Caldwell Scholarship Fund continued to grow, thanks to generous donations inspired by the museum's success and Richard's story. Each year, new cohorts of talented young artists received the support they needed, carrying forward a piece of Richard's enduring spirit. My own health remained robust, much to Seraphina's earlier predictions. The vigorous routine of managing the museum, engaging with visitors, and collaborating with Eliza kept my mind sharp and my spirit buoyant. I discovered a newfound joy in public speaking, sharing the history of the house and its collections with enthusiastic audiences. My social calendar was full, not with forced gatherings, but with genuine connections, with scholars, artists, philanthropists, and passionate individuals who shared my love for art and heritage. Eliza, now a close confidant and practically family, often spent evenings at the house. We would sit by the fire in the library, discussing everything from museum strategy to the latest archaeological discoveries, from personal anecdotes to philosophical musings about the nature of beauty and legacy. She was a breath of fresh air, her youthful perspective balanced by a profound respect for the past. Her own business, based out of the Surrey cottage, flourished, and her restoration work was now highly sought after. She even took on some of the more delicate conservation projects for the museum, her skilled hands bringing new life to fragile treasures. One afternoon, a letter arrived, not from Marcus or Seraphina's lawyers, but from Marcus directly. It was a short, almost terse note, devoid of emotion, requesting the personal belongings that had been set aside for him in Richard's will: his childhood drawings, school awards, family photo albums. He stated he would send a courier to collect them. There was no apology, no expression of regret, no desire for contact, just a detached request. I instructed Doris to gather the box of items. As she carefully packaged them, I felt a mix of emotions. A faint ache for the son Richard had hoped for, a quiet understanding of the chasm that now lay between us, and a profound sense of peace that I had made the right choice. His possessions were leaving, just as he and Serafina had. The physical ties were being severed, mirroring the emotional ones. It was a final closing of that painful chapter. Life, I realized, was not about clinging to what was broken, but about embracing what was good and nurturing what brought joy and purpose. Richard's greatest gift to me wasn't just his love, but the strength he instilled in me to live authentically and without compromise. I had honored his memory, protected his legacy, and in doing so forged my own. Years passed, marked by the changing seasons and the ongoing success of the Caldwell House Museum. It stood as a vibrant testament to Richard's vision and my unwavering resolve. Each spring, the garden he so lovingly tended bloomed in riotous color, welcoming new visitors who explored the meticulously preserved rooms, learned about the rich history within its walls, and found inspiration in the stories of the art and artifacts it housed. I continued to thrive, my life overflowing with meaningful work and cherished relationships. The scholarship fund had expanded, touching the lives of even more promising young artists, extending Richard's philanthropic spirit far beyond what he could have ever imagined. I often met with the scholarship recipients, listening to their dreams, offering guidance, and seeing in their bright eyes the future of the arts. Eliza was now a celebrated figure in the world of antique restoration, her expertise recognized internationally. She was still my closest friend, my confidant, and we continued our ritual of tea in the conservatory, talking for hours, sharing laughter and quiet moments of reflection. Her presence in my life was a constant source of joy, a testament to the power of chosen family, bound not by blood, but by shared values and deep affection. Doris, bless her heart, remained by my side, tending to the house and to me, with the same quiet devotion she had shown for decades. She beamed with pride whenever visitors complimented the museum's pristine condition, feeling a personal stake in its success. The house, once a source of conflict and contention, had truly become a haven, a place of peace and purpose for all of us within its walls. I rarely thought of Marcus or Serafina anymore. The monthly allowance continued to be sent, a small, distant echo of a past that had little bearing on my present. The public scandal they had risked had never fully materialized, overshadowed by the museum's positive narrative and their own retreat into obscurity. They were merely figures from a distant, painful memory, now completely eclipsed by the vibrant reality of my life. One quiet afternoon, sitting in Richard's favorite armchair in the library, a book open on my lap, I looked around the room. The familiar scent of old paper and polished wood filled the air. My gaze settled on a framed photograph of Richard and me, taken years ago, both of us smiling, eyes full of life and shared understanding. I traced the outline of his face with my finger, a soft smile gracing my lips. I had faced betrayal, grief, and a bitter fight for what was right. But through it all, I had held firm to my values, to Richard's legacy, and to my own dignity. The path had been arduous, but the destination was a profound peace, a life rich with purpose, and a home that was truly and completely my own, open now to the world, sharing its beauty and its stories. My life, shaped by love, loss, and ultimately by strength, was now a testament to enduring spirit. I had not just survived, I had flourished. Richard would have been so proud. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by the echoes of a life well lived, I felt a deep, abiding contentment. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.